Hello. Hi. Hi. Look at you. You look wonderful. So good to see you. Woo! Just adorable. All right. So, Jen, here we are.
All right. Nobody's going to be able to hear me. I guess I got to come over here.
Yeah.
Right,
Hi, Jen.
Hi, Vicki.
Well, here we are.
We are here. And what year is this?
14.
14 years.
All right.
of a literary
14
festival.
years. And how many people have been here almost every year?
Lots of people.
A lot of people.
Lots of
That's
people.
good. That's good. All right. So,
well, we have a lot of people to thank, but we'll try to get through this fairly quickly. So first, I think we want to thank the steering committee.
absolutely. So that includes Michael Cameron, Linda Carpino, Mafanwi Collins, Julie Cook, Bethany Dorough, Hannah Harlow, Nana Kennedy, Karen Kruger, Kara Marsh, Alfred Nicole, Giselle Stevens, Sky Wentworth, and Glee Woodward.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.
We could definitely not put this show together if it wasn't for the steering committee.
That's
for
right,
sure.
and the volunteers.
And the volunteers. But also, we couldn't do it without the sponsors. So we'd like to thank the Newburyport Bank, the Institution for Savings, the Greater Newburyport Chamber of Commerce, the Newburyport Public Library, the local cultural councils, Georgetown, Merrimack, Newbury, Newburyport, West Newbury, and locally based foundations. So thank you to all of those.
So sorry, Jen.
Let's give them a round.
Oh yeah, let's give them a round of applause. And then also Bradford and Bigelow, the Daily News, the Current, the Town Common, the Boston Globe. We'd also like to thank Dyke Hendrickson and Hillary Chabot for inviting us to be part of their radio podcasts.
So before we get started with tonight's show, we'd just like to give you a little preview of tomorrow night, because we've got a really great event going tomorrow night, and we've got a little teaser to show you. So let's cue up the video.
Bless you.
I am a member of the Spencer Pierce Little 1919 Book Club, which was then called the Reading Club. This was started by a group of amazing women from the Newburyport area who gathered every week to enjoy each other's company and to read books to each other. Bethany Groff Doral resurrected the Reading Club, and we've been meeting since 2000.
The book club I represent is the West Newbury Library Book Club. It's been in existence about 10 years. We meet monthly. Most of the time, we add a thematic table setting and food that was featured in the book.
Our particular book club has no name. But over 6 years ago, a group of us sitting in front of the bakery decided to read Moby Dick. It's almost a 50-50 split of men and women, which can lead to some very fascinating discussion.
In a book club, we call ourselves the Bi-Coastal Bibliophiles, and there are 6 of us, and we are from the West Coast to the East Coast with a stop in between. We met at a book event, and we wanted to keep the connection going, and we just started meeting on Skype every 3 months, and it's been so much fun.
We've called ourselves Ladies of the Book. The women are of an age now where many of them are retired, so they have time to read the book. That helps a lot. We're a group of 12, so points of view are really quite different.
We only read books that have something to do with New England.
We run the gamut, from fiction to nonfiction to short stories. We even read a graphic novel.
I spent many years teaching literature, and that ignores the fact that it is largely a subjective kind of enterprise.
Many times, a work of literature will be a catalyst for a discussion. We joke sometimes that our book group is almost like therapy.
To me, reading takes you places you would never actually go. I think there's nothing like reading to experience the world.
Thank you. Wasn't that great? We really want to thank Betsy Westendorf for putting that together.
Absolutely.
But if you're here, you probably are in a book club. So come tomorrow night and let's talk about all the wonderful things that book clubs do for us. And
Absolutely.
I think now we're ready to introduce this evening, right?
Well, we're going to start with Donna Holliday, our mayor, Mayor Donna Holliday. And so we'll just see if we can find her. Just 1 second. Mayor Holliday? Look, she's here.
Mayor Holliday is going to read a proclamation for our honoree, Elaine Weiss.
Good evening and welcome to all of you. Welcome to Newburyport, especially those of you who are here for the first time. I'm sorry we're not having a good spring. We oftentimes skip and go from winter to summer around here, for those of you who aren't familiar with our lovely weather. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here once again tonight, and especially to honor this amazing woman. So here's the proclamation. Whereas the Newburyport Literary Festival is pleased to honor Elaine Weiss as this year's recipient of the Newburyport Literary Festival Award. And whereas Ms. Weiss is an award-winning journalist and writer, her magazine feature writing has won prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, New York Times, Boston Globe, and the Philadelphia Inquirer. Ms. Weiss has also written reports and documentaries for National Public Radio and Voice of America. And whereas her long-form writing earned a Pushcart Prize, Editor's Choice Award, she has been a frequent correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor and a proud McDowell Colony Fellow. And whereas Ms. Weiss's books include Fruits of Victory, The Woman's Land Army in the Great War, Family and Friends Guide to Domestic Violence, Broader, Bolder, Better, How Schools and Communities Help Students Overcome the Disadvantages of Poverty. In her book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, Hillary Rodham Clinton was quoted as saying, both a page-turning drama and an inspiration for every reader. And whereas Elaine Weiss holds a graduate degree from the Muddle School of Journalism of Northwestern University, she lives in Baltimore, Maryland, with her husband, Julian Kurluk, thank you, a professor of astrophysics at Johns Hopkins University. They have 2 grown children. Now therefore, I, Donna D. Holliday, as mayor of the city of Newburyport, speaking for its residents and guests, publicly honor Elaine Weiss and declare Saturday, April 27th, Elaine Weiss Day in the city of Newburyport. And this is given under my hand and seal. There you are. Congratulations and welcome.
Thank you very much. Do you want me to say?
Can we just stand back for 1 second?
Okay.
We'll get Linda out here too. We did want to mention that that in addition to all of the things that were said, Steven Spielberg's production company has optioned this book for adaptation with Hillary Rodham Clinton as the executive producer. Not all bad, not all bad. All right, so we're just...
Explain the yellow roses.
Oh yeah, the yellow roses. See these yellow roses? And also Elaine has one, and Linda has one too. Well, the Suffies, who were the suffragettes who came to Tennessee. Now, I'm from Tennessee, so I'm very proud that this happened in my state. The Suffies wore yellow roses. There were 2 camps, but they all wore the yellow roses. And the aunties, if you can even imagine a woman who would be an auntie, well, they wore red roses. It's given me a whole different feeling about red roses. So if I ever see one, thank you very much. So yes, thank you, Jen. Good idea. All right, so we want to also talk a little bit about Linda Hirschman. So that's you. Yeah, that's
so everyone can
your
hear me.
turn. Yep.
So joining Elaine in conversation tonight is Linda Hirschman, lawyer, cultural historian, and author of many books, most recently Sisters in Law, How Sandra Day OConnor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg Went to the Supreme Court and Changed the World. And her upcoming book is Reckoning, the Epic Battle Against Sexual Abuse and Harassment. Linda has taught philosophy and women's study at Brandeis University. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Slate, Newsweek, the Daily Beast, and Politico. She lives in Arizona and New York City. So please join me in welcoming Elaine Weiss and Linda Hirschman.
Thank you.
Hi. Can you hear me? Great. So I have the honor of having a conversation with Elaine Weiss, and as a result, I have read from cover to cover and with great attentiveness her wonderful new book, The Woman's Hour. The closest I've ever been to Steven Spielberg before was that movie about the creature that winds up in outer space. And so I'm indeed honored. I asked Elaine whether she might take a moment or two and share with us kind of an introduction to her work, just in case I missed something. So, Elaine?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much to everyone who's here. Thank you to the festival. Thank you to the mayor for a singular honor. I have to say, I've never had a day named after me before. But I just want to tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book and what it's about. It's about the women's suffrage movement. And I wrote it because I was ignorant of it. I am a voter. I vote in every election. My parents taught me that was very important. I've taught my children that there's no option of not voting in any election, in my book anyway. And I realized that I didn't know how it was that women at one point in history didn't have the right to vote and then did. And I asked my friends, well, do you know how and when women won the right to vote? And these are very highly educated, well-read people. And they all said, no, Seneca Falls. And no one had a really clear idea. And I went to the textbooks and I saw that it was usually one sentence. In 1848, women had a meeting at Seneca Falls, and then in 1920, they were given the vote. And I thought something must have happened in between there. And there's wonderful, wonderful scholarship about it. I'm by no means the first to write about this. There's really excellent, generations of excellent historians who've written about it. But I realized that it had not filtered into the public consciousness. There was not a lot of popular writing about it. You'd find them in bits and pieces. Everyone from Gail Collins to others have written about it. But to put it into its context and to make it a popular read, I wanted people to enjoy reading it, so making it into a story. It is not a novel, however. I have to just put that out there. It is not a novel. It is history. It's popular history. And it basically concentrates on the last battle for suffrage, which occurs in Nashville, Tennessee in the summer of 1920. And from there, I pulled the lens back and tried to explore the entire movement. Who were the characters? What were the themes? What were the arguments? What were the divisions? And what I didn't expect to find was how much it mirrors our times now. And so I tried to write a vivid history where women were the protagonists in a political drama. But I also wanted to be able to see how it figures into both our broad history of America and our struggles right now. And I have to put out there that I wrote the book before the 2016 election. So it's very interesting to see how much it resonates right now. So.
Thank you. So that was one of the first things that struck me when I was reading it. The Sisters-in-Law starts when Sandra Day OConnor is born in 1930 on a ranch in southeast Arizona. So it's 10 years after, right, and she's still alive, although she's no longer on the Supreme Court. So I was so struck by how resonant your book was with the times that I have covered up to the other day, up to, yesterday morning, up to yesterday morning.
Okay.
So I know that after the Civil War, when the ascendant Union and Radical Republican Congress passed the 15th Amendment, establishing the right to vote for men to vote. That in some sense was a defining loss for the movement for women to vote. So I think we can sort of take the late 1860s as a moment when the machine stalled. So I want to ask you, because your book is about its revival, and we are living in such times of roller coaster times for the women's movement, right, of Apex and Nader. How did they revive it after, it wasn't 60 years because the revival started sooner, but when did they revive it and how did they revive it?
Well, just to give a short roadmap there, again, women have been talking about this for decades. Of course, in the Constitution, there's no mention of women having the right to vote, but there's also, actually, the Constitution doesn't mention anyone's right to vote. Right. There is no right to vote. It says what the government cannot do. And for the first decades, it only meant wealthy white men could vote. If you were not a landowner, you could not vote. And so poor white men could also not vote. That gradually gets changed. Then the next big change is after the Civil War with the 14th and 15th Amendments. And you have to understand that the women's movement, when it begins to bubble in the 1840s, which is a time of great foment in lots of political and social and cultural arenas, the impetus is actually that the women we know as suffragists are actually abolitionists. They cut their political teeth in the abolition movement. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone and Lucretia Mott are all abolition workers. They're working with Frederick Douglass. By the way, Frederick Douglass is at Seneca Falls. And becomes really the champion. He pushes the demand for the vote through a reluctant audience there. And so the women work for the Union and work for both emancipation and abolition, and then the end of slavery with the 13th Amendment. They push Lincoln, they push the Congress, and they expect that everyone, there's going to be universal suffrage after the war, that both black men, black women, and white women will get the vote. And they're so sorely disappointed to be told by the Republicans, who kind of look at the political map and say, no, country can't deal with two big reforms at once. And so they are severely, severely disappointed in that, and angry and vengeful. And when you hear about the kind of racist remarks that Susan Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton espouse, this is the time, because they're so angry. They've been betrayed. And so what happens is then they go off on their own. They say, okay, we're going to have a women's movement. It's no longer going to be a universal suffrage movement. We have to take care of ourselves. And they go off and they try all kinds of different strategies that fail or gain a little ground. And some of those are going state by state, because states are in charge of voting law, which is why we're in trouble right now.
Right.
They also do test cases in the Supreme Court. Susan B. Anthony in 1872 votes illegally. She wants to test the law, and she is arrested, and she's tried, and she's convicted of illegal voting. She refuses to pay the fine. It's a very interesting, kind of outrageous trial, and she's hoping it'll go to the Supreme Court. So they're trying all kinds of different things, and they are also splitting. The women's movement splits after the Civil War because Stanton and Anthony refused to support the 14th and 15th Amendment because it does not include women. And Lucy Stone and others say, no, we have to. It's not a good situation, but we have to. And so there's an American Women's Suffrage Association and a national, based in Boston, by the way, and a national American Women's Suffrage, a national. So there's an American and a national. It's not till 1890 that they kind of bury the hatchet and come together and start working together. And that's when they start to revive, because they join forces. It's still a really hard road. They try to win in the states, and so there are scores of state attempts to win the vote by legislative action, or the other route is by popular referendum. Mm-hmm. So here in Massachusetts, there are several referendum, including one in 1915, which fails by a wide majority. Now, only men could vote to decide whether women deserve to vote. So this fails again and again and again. And you see the rifts in the movement over these failures. And that happens in any, we see that in every movement.
That's right.
We see it in the labor movement. The Wobblies get tired of the same old, and they go up and say, we're going to use more aggressive tactics, violent tactics. It happens in the civil rights movement in our century, in the 20th century. It happens in the gay rights movement. I mean, I think it's a natural...
There was a specific split over state versus national strategy in the gay rights movement.
Yes, that's right.
And
for marriage equality.
In lots, absolutely.
Right, and it mirrors the same thing. So you see the women and their male supporters, and they're wonderful male supporters, but you see them having to test out different paths towards gaining the vote. And there are some who say we have to do it state by state, and others say no, only a federal amendment, because there are certain states, and it's quite possible Massachusetts would have never granted the vote to women, or not for a long, long time. Your senators were some of the most impressive anti-suffrage senators in the Congress. So it's very possible that if you went state by state, it would not have worked. On the other hand, if you didn't get the pressure of the states where women could vote, then you wouldn't have gotten the federal amendment. So the best strategy, I think, was going on both paths at once, both tracks, but that also split the movement in certain ways.
Was there a particular thing that happened around 1890 that got them to just say, okay, enough of this squabbling, we absolutely have to be serious about this?
Yeah, there's a series of things. There's leadership. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are getting older. They're in their 80s at this point. And they realize they have to mentor a new generation. And it will take 3 generations to actually accomplish this. The women who start it do not live to see the amendment. And the women who take it over the finish line aren't born when it begins. So there has to be a succession. And Susan Anthony is brilliant at that. It's not Elizabeth Stanton who does it, it's Susan Anthony. She has a whole coterie of what she calls her nieces. And these are young women who she picks for potential, and she grooms them. And Carrie Katz's part of that, Anna Howard Shaw. There's a whole group of young, talented women who she teaches the ropes. She goes out and tours with them. She teaches them how to lecture. She teaches them how to organize. She teaches them how to push the legislative buttons. And I think that's something we're missing. I don't think we have done that. I don't think from one generation to the next, the feminist movement has done such a great job on that.
But in the 21st century, the aging leaders of organized feminism, having failed to mentor the next generation to come along, which is actually a chapter in my new book.
Good.
Right, it's called Feminism Revived, right? I love this chapter the most. They were indeed empowered by the internet, and they were able to meet one another through the new technology, and they were able to proselytize for feminism unfettered by the gatekeepers of the established movement. So it's such a beautiful story, and you would recognize it's Jessica Valenti from Feministing, and Rebecca Traister, who just had a big book about anger, and Anna Holmes, who started Jezebel, and Pamela Merritt, and Pam Spalding, and they all have their blogs, and they really restarted feminism in the 2003 to 2008 period, and then they drifted to the mainstream media, and they're some of the ones who are driving it now. So it's so interesting that, you know, I always say Steve Jobs did more to emancipate women than Susan B. Anthony, because the technology did it. So how interesting that there's so many parallels between
Yes, and I'm just listening to you describe the technology and the communications technology. When the movement begins, the telegraph has just been invented. There's no telephone, there's no typewriter. So how do these women do it? And actually, I say this in my talks, that my editor told me that one of the young editorial assistants came in when I handed in the manuscript and had read it, and she said, "Wow, I don't understand how these women did it without Facebook." How do they organize? And it was going out on the rickety railroads, which were really they were not comfortable places to be, especially for a woman traveling alone. Yeah. They're just crisscrossing the country. They're going on wagons. They are walking in the mud. They're knocking on doors. They're putting out handbills and tacking them up. So that it's really primitive. Even in 1920, when my book takes place, radio isn't there yet.
No,
so you have to imagine what it was like to have 2 million members of the National Association, to have this incredible nationwide network of women who are working in every little town, every little area, every rural town. There's some sort of suffrage agitation. And they're held in contempt in many of their towns. It was not an easy thing to do.
How did they persuade these women in obscure rural towns in Tennessee to be for such a radical political?
I know, and especially, it wasn't just kind of, you know, you couldn't just stand up and say, "Hi, I'm a suffragist, like me." They were, when I give a talk with some, and there's some in the book of the images that are used to deride the suffragists. They're called crazy, they're called unhinged, they're called mentally ill. Of course, they're unsexed. They're considered totally unsexed. You know, they're masculine. There are drawings of a beautiful anti-suffragist and this dowdy, suffragist. It's very clear who's who. And they are called subversive. They're called treasonous.
Right.
And towards the end, they're called Bolsheviks too. Socialists, they're called. So it's everything is thrown at them, and they are. But also, I mean, you think of it in the personal sense. You live in a small town. Your pastor gets up and rails against the idea of women's suffrage because it goes against God's plan.
Right.
Your newspaper editor, cranking out editorials saying this is un-American to allow women to vote. Your garden club is really not pleased that you're a suffragist. You're getting it from all sides, and you had to be brave. You really had to be brave to do this.
So one of the things I write about in my books is the people who see the horizon, the Franklin Kamenies in the Gay Revolution, the Ruth Bader Ginsburgs. How did they see the horizon? How did they know? That's
one thing I marveled at, because again, they work their whole lives, 30, 40 years, and they get nowhere, or they get a little bit, and they see how hard it's going to be to get that last bit. And how do they maintain their confidence? How do they maintain their belief in America, in our democracy? Because it does raise very large questions, which we're still asking about, are we a democracy? What do we consider a democracy if half of the nation can't vote? What do we consider a democracy after 1920 when black women and men can't vote, even though legally they can? 19th Amendment, 15th Amendment, very clear. Congress has the power to enforce it, never does. How do we, our image of ourselves as a democratic nation, how does that square with what we actually do?
I was so struck in reading the book by the weird other issues that were floating around. Like, I'm accustomed to, newsflash, associating most virtuous political behavior with one party that shall remain nameless, and the other. So, but in your story, the Republicans and the Democrats are anti and they're pro, and it's all mixed up.
Well, actually what's interesting is in the beginning of the 19th century, you have to kind of flip in your mind where the political parties stand, so that the Republicans are actually the party of Teddy Roosevelt, Lincoln, right, and Teddy Roosevelt, and they are actually more progressive socially and politically. They support suffrage much more enthusiastically. There are more suffrage states that grant women who are run by Republicans. They ratify more regularly. They voted more reliably in Congress. So it's actually Republicans who are much more the heroes in this story. What you find interesting is all the different, if we think of women's suffrage at all, and I have to say we haven't thought about it very much, this amazing expansion of our democracy, and we know so little about it. And you realize that you think of it, well, it just kind of floated around somewhere and then it kind of came to rest. And it was not affected by other political and social and economic forces. And the thing that was so extraordinary to me in my research was to find it was buffeted by every social, economic, and political force. From immigration. Immigration is a big issue in the nation in 1920 and also in the suffrage movement, because men could move here, live here for a year or two, maybe not speak English, maybe be illiterate, but they could vote. And here you have these college-educated women who can't vote. There's a tension. There's a real tension about that. You have prohibition.
Right, that's just what you...
Prohibition.
Okay, I'm watching dinner now. She's asking lots of questions. Women were in the forefront of the prohibition movement, of the temperance movement. For some it's moral, for some it's a morality thing. For most, it's a domestic violence issue. Right. Because women, by the way, the other things women couldn't do, besides not being able to vote, they could not testify in a court of law. They could not bring civil suit. They certainly could not serve on a jury. So you never were, if you were convicted, being tried as a woman, you would never have a jury of your peers. You could not own, until state laws changed, you couldn't own property if you were a married woman. Your wages belonged to your husband. Your inheritance belonged to your husband. Your children belonged to your husband. You had no custodial rights. So that's among the things that women couldn't do. And so they see the vote as the first key possession to have to change those laws. Now they chip away at it before that, which is a testimony to their power and their tenaciousness. But so they are associated with temperance. And that becomes a disability at the turn of the century, because they're getting defeated in suffrage referenda in states like Ohio, Michigan, New York, Massachusetts, by the brewing interests, the liquor interests. And of course, the liquor interests come out in force in Nashville.
home of Jack Daniels. There is a Jack Daniels suite, even though prohibition's in force, and it's 24/7 liquor to persuade the legislators to reject the amendment, because they fear that women, even though prohibition's been passed, 18th Amendment is done, Volstead Acts are in place, they're hoping that maybe it won't be really enforced too vigilantly. And if they can keep women away from the polls, then they might be able to elect what they call a wet Congress and a wet legislatures, and they just won't enforce it. So that's why the liquor industry is fighting so hard against it.
Right, it was so interesting in
temperance.
the book to think of it taking place in Tennessee and how it intertwined with temperance. Men would come home drunk and beat their wives up. That's what
And there was nothing
really
they could do.
going on.
There was
Right, so there wasn't anything they could do until relatively recently. So that, or they would spend all of their wages, which was the only support of the family, on alcohol. So a lot of the temperance is really a feminist issue in many ways.
Right.
It's, right,
But another issue which they have to deal with is birth control,
right, that's right.
which I found so fascinating, because Margaret Sanger at this time is actually serving time in prison for distributing birth control, or even information about birth control, and running the clinics. And and she begs the suffragists to support her. And they say, we can't, not as a movement. There are individual women and men who do support Sanger and her work, but it's illegal. It is still illegal,
no, right, under the Constitution.
and it's also extremely controversial. And they say, we can't afford to be burdened by another issue. It's that intersectionality thing. And they're saying, no, we can't do it.
So maybe this is the moment for me to ask you the obvious question, which is the people you write about have taken a very bad rap in the last many years, recently, in the feminist movement, for being not only insufficiently intersectional, but anti-intersectional, if there's such a word. They are charged with arguing for suffrage and reassuring the opponents of suffrage that it would never mean that black women could vote and overwhelm the white electorate with votes, and with being inattentive to the concerns of their non-white sisters, and indeed hostile or instrumental.
Well, I try to deal very forthrightly about that in the book, and I give all the instances. But I think you also have to put that in context. And there is a public conversation as we approach the centennial. It's coming up very soon. And there have been articles in the New York Times, many publications, about what some call the racism of the suffragists. And I have to say that is true and not true. They are, I don't want to use that we can't judge them by our standards, because, that can excuse a lot of sins. But what you do have to see is whether they would have been able to achieve suffrage for any women if they had not gotten the southern states, or at least some of the southern states, to support them. I disagree that they said that they were totally, that they made it their policy. There were some southern suffragists who did absolutely advocate for white women only. But most of the leaders really do say this suffrage knows no race. However, when they have to get the Tennessee legislature or the Kentucky legislature, which does ratify, or Congress sits on the amendment for 40 years. It sits there for 40 years. How are they going to get it out? And the only way is to get Democrats control the South. They have to get those senators. And so when the senator says to them, so is this going to mean the end of white supremacy in my state? They say, no, sir, it won't, because there are actually more white women than black women. Is that a cop-out? Yes. Is that the only way you're going to placate these racist legislators and get them to take the first step? Again, 19th Amendment says every woman. Does not in any way say black women cannot vote. What then happens is the way it's implemented in the southern states. Black women in the North and in the West can vote. So it is the southern states. And it's Jim Crow. I don't think we could expect the suffragists to break the entire Jim Crow system on their own. They're not that powerful. And so I think that we have to understand that this was a political judgment. It was in some ways the same political judgment Frederick Douglass has to make when he abandons the women.
Right.
You know, we can't get all of this through at once. Let's start here. And it is the way it is subverted by the Jim Crow laws in the South, the Southern legislators, and the way it is abandoned by Congress, because they have the power to enforce this, and they don't.
Right.
So I think it's unfair to blame these women for a racist society. And they would, I don't believe, you talk to most suffrage historians and they agree, they had to make this judgment. Do they get some part of the loaf or do they get none? I think they truly believe that they then could get all women to vote. And
Well, it only took another, 34
50
years, and then till 50 years till the passage of the Voting Rights Act, right? And then
And now now again.
the Supreme Court has just gutted the heart out of the Voting Rights Act.
And by the way, Asian men and women are not allowed to vote until after World War II. In fact, they're not considered citizens, even if they are native born.
Right, that's why they
and
were, right.
Native American men and women get the vote technically in 1924, but most states don't allow them to vote until sometime late 1950s. So it's very incomplete. And I don't think we can ask the suffragists to have broken all of those taboos. So I don't mean to defend, and I really do deal with the racism, but I also think you have to put it in context. It was a very, very complicated political system they had to deal with.
And you portray it very well. I learned a lot. I, who spend my life in this arena, learned a lot from reading your book. One of the things that I recognized right away was the circular firing squad that we call feminism. And one of the interesting things about Ruth Bader Ginsburg is that even in the circular firing squad that we call feminism, no one ever shot at Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It's a very interesting issue of how she managed to achieve that, in part by not taking credit for a lot of things that she actually was entitled to credit for. Yeah, various, you know, she always had the long view. But I know, and I learned again in your book, about the radical pressures on the suffrage movement and the way it's, but can you talk to us a little bit about how that happened and how dangerous it was and how, okay.
By the way, I have on my mantle framed is a note from Justice Ginsburg thanking me for the book, which I did send her. And actually, the paperback, which just came out last month, my publisher and I, and working with my senator and congressman, we have distributed a copy to every woman in Congress.
Oh, good idea.
Now as several people have said to me, it's the men in Congress who need to read this. And that's very true, but 535, I couldn't ask my publisher to donate those. But to talk about the firing squad. So again, this happens in every movement. It's almost part of the ecology of a reform movement. You have
happens in every movement on the left.
Well, Yeah, it may happen on the right too, but it's certainly more obvious.
Right.
And so, especially when that's cranked on for so long, we're now 70 years into, or 68 years into the movement, and hasn't come to success. And so, in England, it actually happens a little sooner, that a group comes up and says, okay, we're tired of asking. We're not asking anymore. We're demanding it. We're not pleading. We're not going to be nice. We're going to be unladylike. This will sound very familiar. We're going to raise our voices. We're going to be disruptive. We're not going to play by the old boys' rules. And we're going to do things that women are not supposed to do, like picket. And we're going to make big demonstrations. And this is Alice Paul. So what happens is, it happens in England. The Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst, Christabel Pankhurst, they take the suffrage movement in England. It splits, actually even more bitterly than it does here. Over there, they're actually violent. They set off bombs. They destroy property, they crack windows. In fact, a friend of mine went to London recently, and at one of the museums, again, they celebrated their suffrage centennial last year. She gave a pin. I'm wearing the National Women's Party prison pin, which I'll explain to you. But she sent me a little pin from the Museum of the City of London, which is a little tiny, delicate hammer. And it's a toffee hammer. Which was used to crack toffee, I guess, when you make it. And the suffragists there would carry them in their purses because they were very kind of small, but had a heavy head. And then they could whip it out and knock that, the Selfridges display window, and then put it right back in the purse. It was really funny. So young woman, Quaker woman from New Jersey, graduate of Swarthmore, goes off to do her graduate work, her PhD work in England, and falls in with this radical strain of the movement. She comes back home in 1913 and says, I'm bringing these tactics home, because this movement is just it was in what was called the doldrums. Nothing had been happening. And so she says, we're going to shake this up. And she plans this amazing grand march in Washington in 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And so like thousands and thousands of people are actually marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. Hundreds of thousands are watching. Woodrow Wilson arrives at the station and says, where is everybody? And they say, oh, they're watching the suffragists march down the street. But actually it turns violent, and men and boys attack them and literally throw them off their floats. They trample on their signs, they rip their clothing, they punch them, and the police sit back. I mean, there's a huge scandal about this. It serves the suffragist purposes in some ways, because it's such a spectacle. And then she goes on and splits from the mainstream movement, just as happened in England, and says, we're going to have a different strategy. We're not going to forget about the states. We're just going to go for the federal amendment. And we're going to do these more confrontational things. We're going to picket in front of the White House and stay there day and night, day, no matter the weather. And they do. And Woodrow Wilson has to pass them every day. We're going to chain ourselves to the White House gates. We're going to make a little bonfire on the sidewalk and burn the president's words, because at this point, it's World War I, 1917, and he has brought us into a war to make the world safe for democracy. But how can we call ourselves a democracy? Half of our own people can't vote. And so they call out the hypocrisy, and they have signs in front of the White House say, democracy begins at home. So on the other hand, the mainstream suffragists are horrified by this. It was very, very controversial and confrontational, especially in wartime. They had signs that said Kaiser Wilson. and we've sent men to fight. And there was a huge argument about whether this was, never mind just being more confrontational. Now we're in wartime. Is this unpatriotic? Mm-hmm. And does this do more harm to the movement than good? Hmm. And suffrage historians still argue about whether this actually retarded the movement or spun it forward.
The communists had the same issue in World War I.
Yeah, it does happen.
Right.
It does happen. And I have to say, when I read about the young women in Congress who are not playing by the rules, who are being disruptive, who are being told they're talking too loud, I think, Alice Paul.
Right.
It's very much the same.
And it was street theater, which in some sense they learned from the abolitionists. That was, people who have no vote, right, can't threaten. All they can do is these extra legal things.
Right. That's right, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And so they actually, they're the first, the suffragists, the first people to picket at the White House. Never been done before.
And you know who did it later? The AIDS activists in the 1980s, right? That's pure ACT UP.
And then ACT UP comes out of that.
Right.
So it is not unusual for this to happen, but you do see what I write about is in Tennessee in the summer of 1920, there are two different suffrage headquarters. One for the mainstream National American Women's Suffrage Association, the other for the National Women's Party. They do not work together. They have different organizers, they have different strategies, they have different tactics, and they pursue, same goal, but they pursue it separately. And they fall on each other and they step on toes, and there's great personal animosity, and yet they're both going for the same goal. So it's a lesson that it's sad that happens. On the other hand, does that synergy actually propel
that's movement? The question.
And that I think a lot of historians think it. I think it did in many ways. It also shows that we can't expect women to be monolithic in their thinking, because that third strain that I write about is the women anti-suffragists.
Right.
The women who are wearing those red roses. And, right.
There's a woman in the book who is exactly like Phyllis Schlafly.
Oh yes. And you hear those same arguments. That's what's so extraordinary. Again, I'm reading this in I live in 2013, 14, 15, and I'm saying, wait, I've heard these arguments before. This sounds really familiar. If women want the vote, what are they going to do next? They're going to abandon their families.
If men can't hit on women at the workplace, then people will stop having sex.
Right? Yes. Right? Or there are these great anti-suffrage images of, it says, when women vote, and it shows variously mom smoking a cigar and reading the sporting news, and dad has screaming children in this. This is the continuing motif, the screaming children in his arms. And he's having to do the sewing, make his own trousers. And it has a sign that says the new rules, and the men will make trousers out of their women's old skirts. And then there's my favorite, actually this is in the book, my favorite anti-suffrage cartoon. And it shows a hen and a rooster, and the hen is wearing a Votes for Women sash. And she's just walked off the nest. And he calls to her and says, "Ma, the eggs are going to get cold." And she looks back at him and says, "Sit on them yourself, old man. My country calls me." And the tagline is, "A vote for the federal suffrage amendment is a vote for organized female nagging forever." Bumper sticker material, absolutely. And again, it was they saw it as a moral wrong.
Oh, no, as one of my professors at the University of Chicago Law School said after I gave a paper, it is the end of Western civilization as we know it.
Yes, yes.
Right, I know that.
And they did see that, and they saw it. And again, I think we have to understand that, and I have to say, it made me understand what happened in the 2016 election a little better.
Right.
Because these women truly, truly felt that this was going to threaten the family, that women should not be in positions of power, they should not be in the public sphere at all, and that this would not only affect public life, it would affect private life. And that's what made it dangerous.
They feared the effect on private life.
Feared.
That was very clear in the battle over the Equal Rights Amendment in the in the second wave. Right. I actually met Phyllis Schlafly at the Illinois State Legislature in 1973, and she won.
Yes, she did. And she comes out of the anti-suffrage lineage.
She absolutely does.
She comes. They actually do a great job of continuing their cause, and their training grounds, and Phyllis Schlafly eventually does come out of that same school of thought, as do the anti-communist women.
Absolutely.
So they're all, you just see the seeds.
And Phyllis Schlafly is right out of that anti-communist McCarthyite strain.
And you see it begin in Tennessee and in the nationwide ratification campaign, where the anti-suffragists call the suffragists Bolsheviks and socialists, and they have literature that says the red behind the yellow. So the yellow being the suffrage color, and the red behind the yellow. So it's definite that this is part of the line.
So as we come toward the end of our time, I want to ask you a really whiny question.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
Now that I have you here, why, after all that hard work and fight to get the vote, does it end with women, as white women who are most of the voters, voting against their self-interest, voting with their husbands? The last chapter of the book is about after what happens after the triumph. I'm gonna, spoiler alert, they get it through in Tennessee. And then you have these statistics about how they're voting with their husbands, and they voted for Warren G. Harding.
Warren G. Harding, who during the 1920 campaign is being blackmailed by one of his mistresses and has paid hush money to keep one of his mistresses, and has paid hush money to keep her quiet.
Right. Gee.
I wrote this before. I had no idea.
Right. Then the women get the vote, and
they don't use it.
And they don't use it.
They don't use it. So I'm asked this a lot, and Carrie Catt, the head of the National Association, is asked this. Of course, what she has, as soon as women get the vote, she has established her successor organization, the League of Women Voters. Carrie Catt is the founder. They are celebrating their 100th anniversary. I've been talking to leagues all around the country. So women win the vote. Again, I don't want to spoil it. But it's end of August 1920 when this finally gets ratified. And it's only 10 weeks to the election. So what happens? In some states, like Georgia, they refuse to extend the registration period because they don't want black women to vote.
Oh, no, wait a minute, let me get this straight. In Georgia, the state government is messing with
Oh yeah, how about that? Yeah, I know.
Thank you.
It's amazing. Yeah, they don't want black women to vote, so they don't allow any women to vote. In other states, registration has passed, but still only about 1 in 3 eligible women vote. So Carrie Catt is asked by the press, what happened? You've worked for 7 decades. Right. What happened? And she said, voting is a learned exercise. You have to learn to do it. You have to repeat it. It has to be part of your life. That's why it's important to teach children. And most women have not had that experience. So don't worry, it'll kind of come to them. It comes very slowly. And it's not until 1960 that the percentage of women equals percentage of men voting on the national level. And it's not until 1980 that it surpasses it, and we have surpassed since. Percentage of women is always larger than the percentage of men. But people have asked me, so what happened in all those years from 1920 to 1960? And yes, they do vote like their husbands, but also, they had the vote. Legally, they had the vote, but the culture was still a little behind. And this happens too, that sometimes the law actually leapfrogs ahead. And what happened is you're still in your little town, and your pastor is still against it, and your newspaper editor is still against it, and your garden club is still kind of against it. And it's hard to go to that polling booth and cast your vote. It's very public. So I think that's part of it, that women were just not yet comfortable in lots of places doing it.
Right.
And in others, it had to build, but it certainly has to this point. But it is disappointing also that in one of the pieces of research that I treasure, it's not actually in the book, but I found a full-page article in September of 1920, which is just a few weeks after ratification. And it's I think the New York Herald or the New York World, one of the pro-suffrage newspapers. And it says, who has the presidential timber? And it goes, again, it's a whole broadsheet article going through all the suffrage leaders on the national level and saying which ones can run for president in 1924. And which ones should be Secretary of State, which ones are qualified to be governors, taking it very seriously. It's not tongue-in-cheek at all. Goes through what their experience is. These women are highly, highly professional politicians at this point, and diplomats. And it says it fully expects women to be on the national political stage in 1924, in the next cycle. That I found both amazing, disturbing, disappointing. But so what happens in between that goes beyond my research scope. But clearly, weren't quite ready. And are we ready now? Are we ready?
Well, in 2018, white women voted exactly 50-50, Republican and Democrat.
Really?
I write about contemporary politics.
Right.
So, and I have my pet data scientist.
Okay.
That feeds me stuff. Right, he's happy in his lab, and I'm happy to steal his information.
So it's 50-50 for women.
Just came out in 2018. The validated voter roll, not exit polls, validated against the voter rolls, real data shows that white women vote.
So it's minority.
50-50. Well, it was always the gender gap was always the racial gender gap, but this is actually an improvement over 2016, when the white women's vote broke something like 53-47. So different calculations, depending on third-party candidates and stuff, make it a little different. But there was a 2 to 6 point difference, and that narrowed to a tie.
Well, so I'm asked all the time, well, how do you explain the 2016 vote? And I said, read about the anti-suffragists.
Right.
I think
that's right.
That gives you an insight. It doesn't explain everything, but it does give you an insight. And I think we need to learn from how these women organized, how they lobbied. It takes political strategy to get a constitutional amendment. They begin literally at a tea table saying, let's have a meeting. I mean, it's really like Judy Garland. Let's have a meeting.
Let's have a movement.
In Seneca Falls, 5 days notice. How many of you can make a dinner party of 5 days notice? I can't do it. 5 days notice. They put an ad in the paper. That's it.
Right.
It begins there, and it becomes this incredible juggernaut. And yet, it comes very close to not happening. And that's the story I tell in Tennessee. It almost doesn't happen.
Right.
It is very, very, very close. And I think we see that same, as we see our rights endangered again, we should see what their mistakes were, see what their accomplishments were, realize that it's going to take strategy, but mostly it's going to take persistence and compromise.
Right.
And that's the only way you can begin to make progress. They didn't accomplish everything, but it was pretty amazing what they did.
Can we thank you enough?
Well, no,
for
thank you.
the research?
Thank you. And I just want to say that the work that Linda does is really the sequel to the story of the suffragists, whether it's Sandra Day OConnor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who truly embody what the suffragists hoped to accomplish, to have women on the Supreme Court, but even more, the kind of groundwork that they lay all through their careers to women's rights is so vitally important. And then writing about contemporary politics. So it's sort of
iteration.
That's right.
The Me Too movement.
It truly is the next the culmination of it. So thank you very much.
Turner Banks. That's my first question, and I'm not going to tell you. Banks Turner. That's what I meant to say. All right, I'm not going to tell you who Banks Turner is. If you've read the book, you know. But if you haven't, you'll be surprised. Okay, we have a beautiful little dinner over at the Masonic Hall. So wrap up, charge on, and we'll see you there.
See you there.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.